Yeah, I love this topic. Is Rich Dad Poor Dad still relevant today? So when was it published? How long ago did Robert
Nine,
Kiyosaki write
originally published 1997.
it? Hmm.
So yeah, and a lot of the stories I think in it are, talk about him growing up in the 60s and the 70s. So I think a lot of people might read it and go, well, how relevant is a book about investing in the 60s and 70s and published 1997? How relevant is that today? Can it still be relevant?
Yeah, in a fast-paced world that we live in, can it possibly give us any tips or tricks on how to actually invest in property? Well, the short answer is yes. I think it's very, very relevant. There are elements within that book that I still follow in our business today, and constantly going back to and referring to, and believe that it is absolutely relevant. I have to make a confession though, that actually this isn't my favorite book of Robert Kiyosaki's. And the very first one that I read was Increase Your Financial IQ.
Let's maybe tell that story. I think that's a good story. So for those people that do know us, they'll know some of this story. Others might not. So going back to when was it? That must have been going back to about 2008.
2008. Yeah.
2008 is when we started, having come from a corporate background in financial recruitment. We set up our own lifestyle recruitment business just as the 2008 recession hit. So great timing, awesome. So that kind of wiped us out. At the time, we were recruiting for accountants, and we were often traveling overseas and recruiting candidates from the Far East who would then be placed into roles within Europe. And we were out in Malaysia, I believe, Kuala Lumpur at the time,
Yeah.
weren't we?
Yeah. We were at a recruitment fair in KL. And at that point we did have 7 buy to lets, right? And we'd, between us, over 10 years, got those 7 buy to lets by doing it the way that we thought you needed to buy property, which was work hard, save for a deposit, buy a property, and then start saving for the next one. So between us, 10 years, 7 properties, we actually thought we were doing pretty well, because that was more than, say, any of our peers, friends, colleagues, family had any at that point. So we thought, check us out. We've got our own business. We've got 7 buy to lets. We're doing well. And then when our income literally stopped overnight, we thought, hang on a minute, we've got to do something different. And we weren't that passionate about recruitment. It was a means to making money. And I guess for a lot of our listeners, they're probably making money on a monthly basis without being that passionate about their job. I mean, they'll be good at it, and they've monetized their skills and their time to a certain level, but they won't really like be bouncing out of bed and going, yes, can't wait to get into my job today. So when we were in Malaysia, we invested money we didn't have, because I'd read Richard Branson's book, Losing My Virginity, and he talked about expanding your way out of trouble. So when a business is starting to fail, you should actually get deeper into that failure and get even more uncomfortable before you can actually bounce out of it, which went against everything instinctively that we were feeling. We were trying to cut all costs and trying to increase the money coming in. But we invested money to go out to Malaysia, and it didn't really pan out the way we thought it was going to pan out. And it was while we were having some downtime that you said, hey, have you read this book,
Well,
Increase Your Financial IQ by Robert Kiyosaki?
I'm going to give a little bit extra backstory there. So I have to confess that I read this book, the original one, Rich Dad Poor Dad. I first picked that up probably 2001, 2002, because I was in my previous life job in recruitment and hating it and wanting a way out. And I'd always had this bug about property ever since I was at university, and I did the maths on what my landlord was making in our student house, right? So from those days, I was like, you know, that's got to work, right? I've got to be able to do it. So I did read this book, and there were some real light bulb moments in there. I just loved it, and it really did change my mindset. But I got sucked back into kind of working for another 5 years, and it was only, or more than that, 7 years. And it was only when we were out there I kind of revisited it, and we talked about property quite a lot as maybe being our way out, and we were both quite passionate about property.
Yeah.
And I said, right, I read this book, a few years ago. It's never kind of left me. It's always been in the back of my brain. You know, have you read it? And you said no, you hadn't read it, and you didn't really read books at that time.
Yeah,
It wasn't your thing. So
I yeah, I
so I
wasn't
remember
really.
saying, right, well, I'm going to go get it. So I remember jumping in a cab, getting into town, finding a bookstore, went into the bookstore and tried to find this book. And they didn't have this one, but they did have the kind of follow up to it, which was
Yeah,
called Increase Your Financial IQ, which is kind of a, for those of you that know Rich Dad Poor Dad, you know, there's lots and lots of stories in this one. The principles are all there, but the financial IQ one was a bit more punchy. It was a bit fewer stories,
yeah,
more just cutting to the nuts and bolts of it. So
yeah,
I bought that one and a couple of other ones. In fact, we talked about this before we came on that we might actually do an episode just on books because I
yeah.
think there's so much there.
Maybe once a month, do a book that's influenced or changed
Yeah.
our business and how we do things.
But I think everything comes back to this one and the
Yeah.
financial IQ. So I got that one, and I gave it to you to read. And I've never seen you at that time just sit and devour a book, and you did. And I remember you kind of closing the book and went, "We're doing this."
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, if he's buying apartment blocks in Arizona with no money and we have no money, then how do we do this in Edinburgh? How do we do this in the UK? And we're like, right. And actually, you bought a blank journal, just a blank notebook. And we sat, I remember sitting in a pub going, okay, we have 7 properties. How do we get to 10? Because that just buying another 3 when we were like absolutely stony broke just seemed a massive mountain for us to climb. So we thought, yeah, let's get to 10. That will be amazing if we can do that. Right. Who do we know that does it? What do we need to do when we get back to the UK? And we were absolutely clear that we needed a mentor, that we needed somebody that had already done it to show us, because the way we'd been doing it for the last 10 years was getting us nowhere very quickly. On the surface, 7 buy to let sounds great, but when you can't buy your food on a monthly basis, that doesn't really help you much. And that's really where the whole journey and learning this system that we followed and that now we teach other people all began. So there's some key points in this book that I think would be really useful for our listeners for us to highlight if they're not familiar with the book or if they
Yeah.
read it a while ago, that we can maybe revisit just to
Yeah.
show how relevant it is today.
So if I go,
Um,
yeah, if I go back to the very beginning, right, when I read the bit that got me, I'm just going to hold up this chapter because,
well, that's no use if no one's on YouTube right now.
well, if you're not on YouTube, come see us on YouTube. We are there. This Property Life, you'll find us on YouTube channel. But what I'm holding up is a page of the one that grabbed me all those years ago that said it was lesson 5. Lesson 5, the rich invent money. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know, how can you invent money and
Mm,
create money? And, you know, I read this chapter and it was all about being able to buy properties below value, add value. And then in this example you initially use is sell them and make money from never having, you know, even owned it, essentially.
yeah.
Um, and that was just absolutely mind blowing. I was like, what, you know, why are we not taught? Why are we not taught this stuff? You know,